Good morning, everyone. I'm the announcer of today. My name is Wenqing Long from Academia Sinica. Welcome to the conference. So the keynote speech will begin now. Please take your seat and turn off your cell phones during the speech. In this session, the keynote speaker will speak for 40 minutes. We will leave 10 minutes for the floor to ask questions. Let us welcome the keynote speaker, Professor Poul Holm. Okay. Great. And the chair of the keynote session, Professor Matthias Kaiser.
Thank you. And before we let Paul start, I just want to say some brief words about him. He is a really renowned scholar, widely known, and I must say not only in Europe, but around the world, actually. Paul is Professor of Environmental History, Director of the Center for Environmental Humanities at Trinity College in Dublin. He is originally from Denmark, which is a neighboring country to Norway. He is currently President of the European Consortium of Humanity Institutes and Centers, Vice Chair of the Humanities class of Academia Europaea, and Chair of the Ocean Path Initiative, OPI, and President of the European Alliance for the Social Science and Humanities. He was awarded the European Research Council 2017 Champion of EU Research. Earlier, he has served on national and European committees such as the Danish Research Council for the Humanities, the European Society for Environmental History, and the EU DG Research Metrics Group and the ESF Rescue Initiative on Climate Change Research. He has published on fisheries history and marine environmental history, coastal communities and culture, and Viking settlements in Ireland. And I know personally Paul now for some time as one of those engaged scholars who has a firm belief that it's not only the technical sciences, the natural sciences, but the humanities and the social sciences that are important to solve the big challenges of society. So, Paul, welcome as our keynote speaker. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Matthias. And of course, I know Matthias really well from our joint work, which I will be talking to, but Matthias certainly has a share in this, as well as some 20 colleagues across Europe who in the last year have been working on this question: is there a sustainable future for seafood? So, do we really need more food in the world? And how much food do we need? Well, in terms of projections, certainly in the next 30 years, we know that the global human population will increase by about a third. We will need 60% increased food supplies by 2050. And at the moment, only about 2% of our food derives from the ocean. And that, to some extent, is a missed opportunity because, as we discussed yesterday, the demands on agriculture are limited by our resources of land and fresh water, and we are strongly dependent on the industrial production of fertilizers. Whereas in the oceans, we have plenty of space, you would think, we have plenty of water, and we have inorganic nutrients. So there seems to be a potential. However, when we look at the projections for the next 30 years, it's obvious that we have already exhausted the immediate resources in the ocean in terms of wild fish. The wild fish consumption per capita globally has increased dramatically through the 20th century. And by 2000 was above 16 kilograms per person, currently about 18 kilograms per person, but the projected human population increase and the fact that wild fish catches are stagnant means that we are probably looking at almost a halving of that supply per human in only 30 years. So this will come with dramatic consequences for the seafood industry and potentially for human nutrition. So this caused the EU Commissioner, Carmelo Vella, to ask the question in January 2017 to the European academies: how can more food and biomass be obtained from the oceans in a way that does not deprive future generations of their benefit? So this question was received by SAPER, which is a new setup which has been agreed with the European Commission on the part of the European academies. And what we have agreed to is to provide the Commission with science-based policy advice on the condition that the advice is generated in a free and academic forum which is devoid of political interference. So it's very important in this slide to really point out that the academic deliberations were not directed by political interference. This was an open discussion amongst the 20 or so academics who had been selected from across Europe to address this question. And I had the honor to be one of the co-chairs of this group with my colleague Dag Axland from the University of Bergen. He is a marine scientist and I am a historian. So we came up with a report in November, presented it to the high-level group of scientific advisors who are actually tasked by the European Commission to turn academic advice into policy advice. And they received our report and indeed embraced it, as did the Commissioner. It has now been discussed by the European Commission and it is now being pushed forward as a series of implementations. So what I'll do in my talk is talk you briefly through some of the deliberations we had and the recommendations we came up with. So this is the report, and I believe there will be handouts for everyone so you can pick up outside the room to tell you a bit more about the report. So basically the problem in the sea is that we're eating from the top of the food chain. In terms of land resources, you might say we eat from the basic trophic levels, cereals, plants, whereas in the ocean we're really killing off the lions of the savannah to eat our food for everyday sustenance. We take out the tuna, we take out the cod, all the top predators of the ocean are seen by us as stable food, whereas of course we are not really tapping into the huge supplies that are provided by plants and lower organisms in the ocean. They are really not marketed as human food, except for obviously the Asian cuisine, but even in Asia, not as much as you would think. So this is the problem, that agricultural food is from the lowest trophic levels, whereas today's most food from the ocean is harvested at really high trophic levels, and that top trophic level 5 is actually exaggerated just to make it even visible. So we are really tapping into a minute resource relative to what we could potentially be tapping into. And that causes, of course, the problem of the global marine catches, that already by around 1990 we really reached the ceiling. The ocean will not yield more when we put all the different wild catches together. This is the long-term view that we get, that basically through 1960 we had a total global catch of around 30 million tons, increasing to, and this is the black line in the middle of the graph. These are the total reported catches, really plateauing around 80 million tons globally. You can see on top of that, actually, we have estimates of total illegal and unreported catches, which may be taking our total contribution up to 120 million. These are highly debated figures. This is not an exact science. Much of this is guesswork. But that's the region of probability we're within, between 80 and 120 million tons. And regardless how we model this, we have plateaued. There is no increase, and no increase is foreseen. Obviously, we have aquaculture contributing new sources of food from the ocean. Very often it's said that aquaculture has already surpassed marine wild catches. That is not actually true, because what the FAO and other organizations do is they lump together freshwater aquaculture and marine aquaculture, or mariculture. But if we only look at what the oceans provide, mariculture is actually not that well developed. And what you're looking at here is the mariculture production, which is still only less than half of the total wild catches from the ocean. And most of that mariculture really is aquatic plants and mollusks, whereas fish, which we prefer currently for our food, is a tiny proportion of that. So what are the projections? Well, obviously, climate change will change some of these conditions. And we know that the bottom line is that with climate change, there will be a change in abundance, basically shifting abundances from warm to cold waters. So you might say the global south is set to lose out as a consequence of climate change, whereas the Arctic especially is set to gain from climate change. However, aquaculture and mariculture really is a different picture altogether. The top panel is the current production of mariculture, and the projected potential production is in the lower panel. And you can see that here the picture is the opposite. The global south is set to increase its production, whereas in the global north, we have actually already utilized most of the potential for mariculture. So these are the projections that we need to bear in mind. Shifts in capture, which anyway will be quite limited, and increases in mariculture, which is likely to be of more importance, shifting to especially the Southeast Asia and to Latin America. So with those very quick overviews of the current state and our projections, what are then our options for the future? And we looked into an array of options, and the one that really seems like a very low-hanging fruit is to be smarter. You would think that that is the obvious way to go. However, we have actually instituted systems around the globe which keep us on a path which is totally unsustainable. And one of the main culprits here is the fact that governments prefer to provide subsidies for a fishing fleet which continues then to pursue catches in a less than optimal way. The subsidies globally have been estimated at around $35 billion US. Again, it's a controversial figure. It's not dead set, but most of that subsidy is in the terms of fuel tax concessions. Basically, there's no tax on the diesel that is being used on boats, which means that we actually subsidize less efficient trawlers in mid-waters to continue taking out and hitting the waters which are already heavily overfished. So basically we are over-capitalizing a fishing fleet which is giving us diminishing returns. In addition, we have very poor compliance. The regulations are simply not being heeded to. And there is enormous waste and discards. In total, we estimate that better management might increase our total global production by about 50 to 60 million tons. So this is substantial. We're talking about perhaps as much as 35 to 50% increase of total production by just being smarter. The second option is much more controversial, namely to go for new species in the ocean, species which have so far simply not been hit by us, the mesopelagics and the krill. So the krill is well known, I suppose, to all of you. Obviously in the Antarctic, a major food source for higher trophic levels such as whales. We could perhaps tap into the krill possibly in a sustainable way without harming the whales very much by hoovering up, as this already has been demonstrated. This is technology that is actually already put to practice. Basically a large-scale hoover which pumps up krill on board the ship. So that's certainly technology which the Norwegians are leading. A second and even more controversial option would be to go for the bristlemouths, the mesopelagics. These are tiny fish, no more than 5-6 centimeters length, but they are super abundant. We are talking trillions of individuals. They're spread across the global ocean. All the red here is where there is an abundance of the bristlemouth. They live in the mesopelagic and bathypelagic, so in very deep waters, and currently they are not being fished. And indeed, if we started fishing them, we wouldn't know what to do with them because the industry is simply not prepared to process the fish. But obviously, it's a huge protein resource because it's super abundant. The problem is we have no clue about their ecological importance. They may not be that important, but they could be absolutely critical to ocean health. We simply don't know. So even with a very precautionary guideline, we might be able to take out, say, 20 million tons out of the mesopelagics and the krill. If we were less cautious, we could even go up to 100 million tons. But of course, this would be extremely controversial. We are putting forward the options here. So option 3 is increasing mariculture. Basically, increasing an industry which has already demonstrated that it is hugely successful. In the last 20 years, and that's the top panel, aquaculture has had the highest growth rates of any food industry. Chicken or vegetables have grown by less than 5%. Aquaculture has grown by more than 7.5% in the last 25 years. And yet, aquaculture, and that's the lower panel, represents a tiny proportion of the food sources that are being made available to the human population. So clearly we could increase the aquacultural production to the benefit of humans. So let me sum up so far. We guess that we have in total wild catch and mariculture probably in the region of 138 million tons from the ocean in 2015. So that's what we have, that's what we're eating. And we could, if that's our only priority, we could perhaps more than double that, not in the distant future, but with existing technologies and within the next 2 decades. So by 2040, we could double our production from the ocean using existing technology. By managing better, that would give 50 million tons, going for new species, an additional perhaps 20 million. And we could grow the mariculture industry perhaps even by 150 million tons. However, that third big option comes with the caveat that in order to do that, we need to change the diet towards lower trophic levels. We need to increase the importance of plants. And we can do it in 2 ways, either by changing the dietary behavior of the fishes, basically turn the fishes from carnivorous to herbivorous animals, or we could change ourselves. So I'll go through those options. First, let's look at the option to turn carnivorous fish to herbivores. It's not as crazy as it might seem. This is actually happening already in a big way in the salmon industry. Wild salmon is at a trophic level of about 4. Through industrial engineering, Norwegian salmon is now at a level of about 2.3. So we have trained, or we have developed the feed to salmon to a degree that has turned salmon from carnivorous to herbivorous, which is a huge success. There's no doubt that this is a fantastic achievement, and it's been done at relatively limited costs to the human health of the food. The salmon is useful to our sustenance. But of course, the industry has gone through lots of problems. Diseases in aquaculture are well known across the globe. People know that the aquaculture industry has come with tremendous problems. Diseases have spread. The use of antibiotics has increased in the industry. Genetic modification has caused anxiety about the escapees of captured salmon released into the wild, again genetically polluting the salmon stocks. And now in the Atlantic, the sea lice problem is enormous. On top of that, the ocean is really not that vast. We are looking at tremendous pressures on the ocean space because most of the aquaculture is actually in inshore waters where windmill industries, tourism, and indeed local citizens are complaining about their access. So there's a real competition for space for this industry. Aquaculture, as I showed you, in Norway is already pushing at its limit in terms of its spatial access. Of course, we could introduce new ways of doing aquaculture. And one thing would be to learn from Asia, especially the integrated multi-trophic aquaculture, which basically means that you have both vegetarian and carnivorous species in the same pond, which means that you can increase and actually have a much more or less polluting environment. Certainly the Chinese have been very successful in doing this. However, it has come with an increased use of fertilizers to do this, so not a simple solution. And it does come with a change of the inshore environment. We are looking at tremendous changes to our coastal environment. So if we want to push for this, we also need to accept that there will be tremendous changes to how the ocean looks like. Or we could simply say, well, let's not put pressure on the sea. We could go inland. And indeed, high-end aquacultured products are being produced, especially in Europe and North America. Saves water, it limits the spread of disease and waste, but it's a very limited product range in terms of species, and it's really just substituting the very high-end aquacultured products. So it's not really increasing the total production of food for the world, but it certainly feeds those cities that are willing and able to pay for high-quality fresh fish. For that luxury market, it's a good solution. And then I come to option 3D, which is, what about ourselves? Could we change? Which is quite a tall order, you might say. But look at us. We eat happily from the table without thinking too much about where we source our food. We tap into the biodiversity of the planet. We shift food thousands of miles. We could increase ocean literacy. We could be cleverer about what we demand, what we eat, and we could provide that information to consumers who may actually be concerned but not aware when they make their food choices. We could eat smart by simply going for the lower trophic levels. There's plenty of food to be had if we shift from eating the lions of the savannah down to being grass eaters. Or in the case of learning from Japanese nori seaweed, we could eat mussel, we could eat algae, kelp. There's plenty of opportunity here, but is it possible? Will we not resist? Will we not insist that we get our bloody meat rather than the plants? And people say, well, we don't change. Forget about it. People don't change. We all know. No, we don't learn. And it's not true, of course. As a historian, this is where I come into practice as a historian. I say, that is not true. Actually, when we look at this picture, we of course realize that we changed, because this is a mother with her 2 kids in the back of the car, happily puffing away on her smoke. And we realized, no, that's not what you're supposed to do. That actually is really bad practice. But think about it, 30 years ago, it wouldn't have been really much of a problem. People have been smokers for certainly a century or 2 without that causing too much of cultural uproar. But now it's really very bad. So we have changed. We have changed our tobacco uses. And how did that come about? Well, it came about as sort of, not as a political diktat, but by a coalition of forces. The Marlboro Man in the 1950s was a symbol of masculinity, of machismo, but today much more a symbol of cancer, of emasculation. And the change has come about, and my colleague Charlie Travis and myself have argued this in a paper, that it has come about in a coalition of forces which has included experts who were, of course, attacked and tried, the industry tried to silence them in the 1950s, by crazy people who said, I want to live in a smoke-free environment, and they were ridiculed, and people pointed at them and said, you are antisocial because you don't want to be in my room while I'm puffing away. What's wrong with you? And institutions, hospitals, medical agencies, which took on board this and slowly started to promote healthier ways of looking at tobacco use. And eventually, even politicians. But politicians are sort of the last, sometimes actually very pivotal, very important actors, but they don't really push the agenda. They respond to a popular agenda. They realize that now, actually, to ride the cusp of popularity, you need to shift from ridiculing to adopting a new agenda. Therefore, globally, we can see that the changes in tobacco use, but also in many other fields like HIV prevention, same-sex marriages, you name it, a lot of social transformation has happened in the last generation, but it doesn't happen within the cycle of a politician. It happens through a generation. So we need patience. We need to also take the long view. We need to play the long game. This is not something that we can just articulate and then hope, all right, it will be changed tomorrow. No, we need to build coalitions. We need to be smart about how we go about doing this. Who would be our best allies in a smart food revolution? Maybe chefs, the new celebrities of this century, the chefs who are popular cooks in media, who invent new restaurant concepts and try out new recipes. We certainly need them to take a lead here, to come up with imaginative new ways of eating. But we need more than that. We need institutions, probably the likes of cities. We have a benefit that the marine food is seen as healthy food. It's part of a young, urban lifestyle which taps into the sea as a source of healthy protein. So we can build a coalition with those cities that want to be young, agile, at the forefront, food-smart cities. Milan in Italy has branded itself recently as a food-smart city, simply by recognizing that here is enormous potential for marketing the city as really a leader of urban lifestyles. And I'm happy to say that the right-hand panel there is an Asian website. So clearly here we are looking at potential of looking into building coalitions with cities. And we can build it on top of a digital agenda because, again, consumers are asking for information. People are concerned, but we need to be able to provide consumers with the information. a digital platform that could be pushed by municipalities, by urban authorities, would provide you with links to where can you source your sustainable seafood around the corner. Dietary change is happening. It's just one example that I picked up last week. This is the famous fish and chip shops in the United Kingdom, which were actually itself an example of food technology and innovation in the 19th century, really made possible by the introduction of railroads that brought cheap protein, fish, to the urban poor who had no kitchens in their home and therefore needed street food. And the chippy, the fish and chip shop, was developed in the 1850s and 60s as a response to this demand by the urban working poor. Now, of course, the chippy is being threatened by many other outlets. In recent years, the number of fish and chip shops have dropped from a top of 35,000 shops down to a projected 10,000 shops. And it's to do, of course, with the fact that fish and chips are a very specialized product that require the use of a lot of plastic, which is seen as really problematic. It's dependent on a single resource, namely the haddock, which is a threatened species. And it's not particularly healthy on top of that. So again, we are looking at dietary patterns changing, not day to day, not year by year, but certainly at the decadal level, we are looking at dramatic changes. And indeed, I don't need really to remind you that, of course, the Western dietary habits have been completely transformed by the sushi revolution. When I grew up, I remember distinctly, in my family, we said, the Japanese eat raw fish, would you believe it? And now, of course, it's seen as a no-brainer. Yes, of course, you would go and grab your sushi for your lunch or whatever. It's no longer even a thing. It's just an everyday practice in your supermarket. But unfortunately, this dietary revolution has really tapped into the top end of the trophic levels of the ocean. We are eating the tuna more than we are eating the nori. So I believe a humanities social science approach can actually inform this global cultural change that needs to happen. We need to understand how people tap into the ocean. And this is the United Nations map, which shows that the marine food consumption really differs country by country. We need to understand much more of this. There's a huge agenda here of understanding why. So to sum up, why are we not producing more food from the ocean? Well, the wild catches, there isn't any more to be had. Mariculture, there are huge space constraints. Consumer perception is bad. There are public constraints. There's a deficiency of ocean literacy. But we could do more. We could go wild, and to my opinion, crazily go for the krill and mesopelagics. We could grow mariculture by, as we do, turn carnivores to herbivores. We could certainly do better management, but the best option, really, because it taps into that huge potential of the plants of the sea, is a smart food revolution, which only can happen in our brains. Food-related problems tend to be wicked, almost insoluble, because you throw up one solution, then another problem turns up. It adds to your conflicted nature. of a globalizing economy and resource constraints. All of that, but human habits do change. I insist on being optimistic. I don't want us to really be bogged down in a Bermuda Triangle of identifying all the problems. I think we can certainly change our ways. However, this is a long game. But remember, in the ocean, we have only domesticated wildlife in the last 100 years. On land, we have done that for 10,000 years. So it's a 10,000-year catch-up we're playing in the ocean. And for that, we need to be smart. And I've never come, and these are my last slides, never come across anyone smarter than the Taiwanese. I visited Kirill a few years ago, and I was struck by this. I wanted an ice cream, but I got a sea screen. You can tap into the wealth of the ocean by eating algae and shrimp products which have been turned into ice cream. So there you are. You can actually give your kid a healthy ice cream. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was, as always, very engaging and enlightening. And we do have some more time for some questions or short comments. Please do not make them long, but we will have a little break afterwards. But please come up and give us a sign.
I believe this is available to you outside. Yeah.
I see a gentleman over there. Yeah. Please say your name.
My name is Charles Trappe. I was just asking if you would please clarify the acronym for SKP pollution resulting from the genetic modification of organisms. It's not familiar to me. You had mentioned SKP pollution.
SKP.
Pollution.
He's thinking you're using an acronym. What you said is escapees.
Yeah, escapees.
Oh, escapees.
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
My apologies.
All right. Okay.
It's very clear now.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
There's another.
Yeah, escapee salmon. Yes. All right.
Good morning, my name is Johannes. I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on aquaponics, because this might be an important field in the future, especially also talked about the herbivore diet, to using insects as feed for aquaponics.
Yeah, yeah. No, absolutely super important, and there's lots of potential. Again, we didn't really go into that because it's very much a developing field. We wanted to constrain ourselves to known technologies without making wild assumptions about the potential, which is certainly great in aquaponics, but where we thought, well, actually difficult to really predict anything with any kind of confidence. So we were constrained by the need to provide advice to politicians who are asking, how can we generate more food now? So that's a different agenda, and it's one constraint on our advice which we accepted, that we were not trying to oversell science as the solution to our problems. We were simply, so that's why.
Thank you. I think people are working on that, particularly in the context of small food cities.
Sure.
But it's very much working. Where
Yeah.
was- Here, over there. Oh, sorry, I had him first and then her.
Okay, thank you. It's Song Chen from National Iran University. Actually, I did my PhD study in Scotland, University of Stirling, Institute of Aquaculture. I think you know well. So I really appreciate your talk, giving us some advice and also good construction. To how to eat smart with the seafood. I think it's quite informative as well. A good suggestion to eat smart. However, the point probably is we need to know where to get the smart seafood. Like you need some, how we say, the sustainable index with the seafood, or how we are promoting is the responsible fisheries index, stands for RFI. That means you need to put some index or figures to evaluate your seafood. The, how we say, is a labor. Is a trophy labor is one of the index, and also other something like the fishery method. So altogether, we have 5 index. It's a locally established, try to promote, how we say, the sustainable seafood. So I would like to share some of you, if you have interest to see, is promoted by the Upweighted 永生海洋，他们有一个很好的一个概念，to promote the sustainable seafood. Okay, that's my comment. But also the last one, unfortunately, I know the original owner. She's my senior graduate. Unfortunately, it's been shut down at the moment, as I know. 那个什么，以前的那个冰箱蟹酱。Okay, that's my point. Thank you. Yeah.
So, Paul, before you answer, I have 2 more speakers who want to say something. Maybe can you just keep that in mind? And then the lady over there, please, can she have a microphone?
Oh, yes, sure.
And then Mimi.
Hi, Dr. Holm, and my name is Kirill. I'm from National Taiwan Museum, and I'm doing a sustainable seafood or sustainable New Year table initiative. I've been doing that for 3 years, and I'd like to share that maybe after the talk. And my question is, I'm really interested that you mentioned the SAPEA. Sorry, I don't know how to spell it, how to pronounce it. This project, there's been marine scientists and youth historian working together, and I think that's quite interesting interesting case for us, because a scientist working with historian, how does that work, and can you try to probably share some of the experience? Yeah, thank you.
Yes. Thank you, and now here, Mimila.
Thank you. So most of your advice was for more production. I mean, there's some smart eating, I guess, at the end, but I think there's a lot of challenges that would be associated with it, and it didn't seem like the advice came with any advice on how to implement the increased production. Because I think there's a lot of institutional challenges, and then it would create like questions of how would you do it, who would benefit, and for example, the Norwegian salmon aquaculture, I mean, it's rife with issues. And you mentioned that they're turning salmon into a herbivore, but then nutritionally it doesn't have as much benefits to humans. And so my question is, why not propose a more ethical approach to the current use of marine resources? Because I think tackling waste and discards through better regulation, and also food waste. There's about 50%, I think, of food that's wasted. So rather than trying to produce more and this frenzy of always greater production and consumption, maybe smarter use, more ethical use might be another way to go. Because I think it's a little bit dangerous to present scientific advice that is proposing more production, because you don't tackle the more difficult questions of the how.
Okay, thank you. Paul,
Yeah,
you're last.
thank you. Right, so I'm afraid I didn't completely catch your comment. Some of it was in Chinese, I believe, but I'd be very interested to talk to you afterwards, especially on that experience with the sea scream and that development. On the question of the SAPEA, well, scientific advice for policy by the European academies, is the meaning of the acronym. I think globally there is an increasing sense that the big challenges confronting us, climate change, environmental degradation, or indeed drinking water, food access, etc. At the heart of it is not really a technological problem. It's not that we don't have the resources. Even if we are tapping into the planet as if we are crazy and we are using up the planet's resources already in August on a yearly basis, there is enough resource for us, and certainly in terms of food, we have enough food, but we are not very smart about how we deal with our food. We waste a lot and we don't produce it in intelligent ways, and lots of what we do is actually harmful to ourselves. So why is that? Well, probably the main reason is bad habits stemming from how we have identified our pathways in the past, industrial practices that have been ingrained. Citizens have bad practices that need to change, and we have enormous waste caused by military investments instead of in food. I showed the picture of the global food consumption. One of the things that I didn't have time to go into is, of course, that in the last few decades, Africa has really lost out in terms of seafood consumption, because a lot of seafood is being sold to Europe for money, and the money is being spent on military. So it's an obvious problem of human politics. So at the heart of all these global challenges is really the human. In the age of the Anthropocene, of course, the human is the planetary agent. So we need to change our practices. And that exactly is the message that is coming through even to politicians. Certainly in Europe, I think also increasingly in other areas, that we need to shift our practices. And in order to do that, there needs to be a collaboration between the sciences and the social sciences and the humanities. That divide cannot be continued in the future. We need to learn from insights into the human brain, into human practices, into human customs. So we will all be better off if we can really tap into the resources of the humanities. And so far we've been really bad at doing that, partly because it's not being encouraged by politicians in the past, but also because our academic institutions don't encourage it. And indeed, I and many of you, I'm sure, have been brought up in practices which are simply inimical to collaboration. So for me, it was a great pleasure to actually practice inter- and transdisciplinary collaboration with a lot of scientists for this project. And finally, yes, indeed, we did address the question of how to produce more. I totally agree with you that a lot of these potential increases in production come at cost. There's no doubt that mariculture has enormous problems, and the wild capture fisheries fraught with problems. Smarter management, yes, is the way to go. It will not solve the issue if the issue is how can we generate more food from the ocean. We are down to the basics of how much food can we get out, and then you need to add it all up. And we are looking at, we need to be smarter. Yes, it will not really generate that much more food. So we also need to look into ethical ways of producing. Final word.
I'm sorry, I have to cut you short here, and I'm sure there are even more questions. But Paul will be around for at least some time to be talking.